Welcome back to Top 5 Stories for each Doctor in this episode, because this is part 2, we're doing the second Doctor. If you thought I was going to do any other Doctor, then you clearly don't know how to count. If you need a quick refresher, this is part of a new series where I'm going to do my top 5 stories for each Doctor from 1 to 13, with the exception of the War Doctor because I haven't experienced enough of his content, and that's pretty much all you need to know. Each of these lists is also going to be expanded media friendly, so TV episodes count as well as any novels or audios from Big Finish or whatever, basically. Basically any story from any medium can be put on this list because I said so, and without any further ado, let's get going. Okay, top 5 second Doctor stories list. Like last time, these aren't in any particular order. So first one up I've got is The Evil of the Daleks. This is one that I only watched very recently, given how the DVD only came out like a year and a half ago. I got this one for last Christmas, or birthday, whichever one. And I think this is, I'm actually surprised by just how good this story was. It's the last appearance of the Daleks until the middle of the John Pertwee era. Originally intended to be the actual final Dalek story ever in the show back in 1967, which of course we all know how that particular plan turned out. You can't kill off the Daleks, mate, you just can't do it. This story is just really engaging, and considering it's 7 parts long, which, you know, a lot of the time in Classic Who, especially in the 60s, stories, despite being good, they could tend to drag on quite a bit, especially ones that go above 6 parts long, which were not quite so common, but there was still a fair few of them back then. This surprisingly went by like really quickly, honestly. That 3 hours or so just whizzes by like you're watching, I don't know, like a new Who 2-parter perhaps. It's a missing story, so I watched the animated DVD release, of course. So that's my only frame of reference. I don't know whether my opinion would be affected, whether this story still existed or not, but overall I just really enjoyed it, and I think out of the 2 Troughton Dalek stories, while I do like Power of the Daleks, I think that's pretty good. I think overall I would have to say that I prefer Evil of the Daleks, just because, I don't know, I found it slightly more engaging for the most part. There was parts of Power of the Daleks where I sort of zoned out a little bit, not gonna lie. Yeah, I've just got to give the top spot to Evil of the Daleks out of those 2, so yeah. Next up, I'm gonna do The Enemy of the World, which is like the James Bond story of 60s Doctor Who. But yeah, The Enemy of the World, is rightly so, is regarded as one of the most popular Troughton stories, and I can definitely agree with them. I can see why people think that. It's brilliant. The whole idea of the Doctor and the companions landing on Earth in the future, well, the past now. This story is set in 2018 as envisioned by the production team in 1968. And that should give you some idea of the setting we're talking about for this episode. But yeah, they just land like in the future and find out that there's this crazy Mexican politician dictator guy who's trying to take over the world. And surprise, surprise, he's an exact doppelganger of the Doctor. Now, this wasn't the first time that Doctor Who did this. They did it back in the Massacre, but that story's missing. So this is the only one we've got to work with that has Doctor doppelgangers in the Classic era, really. Unless you count Android Invasion and Resurrection of the Daleks. Fuck it, where was I? I just really love The Enemy of the World. It's like this big, it's like a really big scale James Bond style action spy thriller kind of story. It's a bit like a pure historical, except it's set in the future. There's no like alien villains or sci-fi elements to it, except for futuristic tech developed on Earth by humans. So that's the only real sci-fi aspect to it. And of course all of the villains are human and everything. It's just a fucking mind-blowing story, especially for 60s standards. There's a very cinematic quality to it at points as well, especially some of the location filming in part 1 on the beach and all that stuff. And it's just so fun to see Patrick Troughton playing both the main hero and the main villain in a story. I highly recommend The Enemy of the World if you haven't watched it already. Number 3, I'm going to put The Mind Robber, quite possibly one of the trippiest, most batshit crazy and inventive stories in all of Classic Who, definitely from the 60s at least. Just 5 episodes of pure nonsense of quite possibly the best kind. The Land of Fiction as a location is an absolutely inspired idea in the Who-niverse. Kinda wish they'd go back and explore it sometime, not gonna lie, but until they do, then we've got to make do with this story, and to be honest, I'd be happy with that as well. So many what the fuck moments in this story, like some of the cliffhangers, especially part 1, some absolutely ludicrous ideas, and one very inventive way of getting around the issue of having an actor off sick for a week. Jamie gets turned into a cardboard cutout for an episode and has the wrong face, so they recast him for a week because he had chickenpox, and then he came back the next week. What other franchise could you do this in? What other Doctor Who story could you possibly pull that off in without looking silly? I don't think you could. This story is so unique and amazing. Honestly, to this day, I think it's so rare that Doctor Who ever reaches the same creative and inventive heights that this story does, and it's just so entertaining. Really recommend The Mind Robber. I mean, I'd recommend all the stories on this list, but The Mind Robber especially, I think. Next one, we're going to have The Invasion, the big 8-part Cyberman story from towards the end of Season 6, or about the middle of Season 6 anyway. While this one's 8 parts long, that sounds quite daunting, I know, but it just whizzes by. I think I named this one my favourite Second Doctor story, actually, in a video at one point, so this is like my top favourite Troughton story out of the top 5. Like I say, it's 8 parts long, but it just whizzes past in like a matter of an hour or two. It feels like less than an hour and a half. Great use of the Cybermen, even if they don't appear as much as you would expect. Cybermen actually don't make an appearance until the end of part 4, halfway through the story. But that's okay, because all the characters in this are just so entertaining. The main human villain, Tobias Vaughan, is one of the best, if not like probably the best, depending on who you ask, out of all of the human villains in this show in general. Also sees the return of the Brigadier as well, after his first appearance, albeit as a colonel, in the Web of Fear during the previous season, and this is actually the first ever unit story, so there's a lot of milestones that happened in this story. That, and it was also a test run for the John Pertwee era that would come a year after, because they were worried about budget, so they thought, okay, let's test the waters and see if Earthbound Doctor Who could work, and it did. Ended up working for a good 5 years or so during the following decade, so there's a lot that we have to thank this story for, I think. A lot of iconic moments as well. Cybermen on the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral, I think it is. There's just a lot to love with this story, and I think if you're worried about it being 8 parts long and you're worried about it dragging on, don't be. This is one of the best paced stories in all of Classic Who. You will not regret watching it. Okay, trust me. The Invasion, brilliant. Best Troughton story overall, I'd say, personally. And lastly, we're going to have the War Games, Patrick Troughton's final story. If you thought The Invasion was a big epic story, then the War Games is 10 parts long. Yeah, it's a long story, it's a big story, and it's got a big, grand plot to match. I have heard some people say the War Games is actually pretty bad, which I have to say, are we watching the same story? Like, I get it, it's 10 parts long, there is backtracking between locations, but I mean, given how this is all about different war zones on a planet designed to simulate wars from Earth history with a central control centre in the middle, the whole plot revolves around what's going on in these zones, so it makes sense that there'd be backtracking between a lot of them. And yeah, it's 10 parts long, there's gonna be a few draggy moments here and there, but the intrigue of what's going on and just the sheer scale of the villain's plan in this, I think, makes it worth the watch. It's got the first ever appearance of the Time Lords as well, as like a society, right at the end, and it's probably one of the best depictions of the Time Lords as well, before the rest of Classic Who just turned them gradually into less and less interesting, stuck-up politicians on an alien planet that looks barely any different to Earth, except the exterior of their city just looks like some kind of wasteland with a Mexico-coloured tint filter put on it. As a way to round off the Troughton era, I think it works. It just works really well, you know, there's a lot to like in there. Yeah, just gradually seeing all these different layers of this multi-layered story gradually get uncovered. It's just like one big reveal after the next. I highly recommend the War Games. That was the top 5 stories I ended up picking, and we're going to go through some honourable mentions that I rate highly but didn't quite make the list as well. Very quickly, the honourable mentions, we've got Power of the Daleks, we've got the Moon Base, we've got the Macro Terror, Faceless Ones, and The Tomb of the Cybermen. All stories that I think are fantastic, but they didn't quite make the cut because the other 5 stories, I think, rank a bit higher. There you go, I guess. That was my top 5 Patrick Troughton stories, or top 5 Second Doctor stories. They're one and the same, Jake. Why are you clarifying this? I may not be very good at justifying why I chose those stories, other than gut feeling, but hey, this is what I ended up with. Feel free to comment your top 5 or top 3 or top 10 or just top whatever Second Doctor stories in the comments below, and leave a like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already. I'll hopefully see you all in the not too distant future for the next video, and until then keep on hooing and I'll see you all then. So goodbye for now. Bye! Yeah.